But thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Okay. Thank you so much. And help yourself. Thank you so much. And I want to welcome all of the new faces also and everyone. All right. So as we've done now for the past few weeks or few months, I do want to, since really this class was started, as we've mentioned many times, to bring healing also to Rabbi Steinsaltz, to pray and really request from God that he starts to speak again. He had a stroke 2 years ago. Okay, we'll dive right back to the chapter on the Torah, 57, if I'm not mistaken, right? Paragraph title, one of the means of contact. All right, so just to recap very quickly, this chapter, as the title indicates, speaks of Torah. And he started saying the Torah is not just from heaven, the Torah itself is heaven. That the Torah is also the spiritual DNA of this world, we called it. The Rabbi Steinsaltz speaks of this passage from the Zohar, the foremost book of Kabbalah, that says that God created the world first by looking in the Torah. So in other words, the Torah was the architectural plan of this world, if you want to look at it that way. God created the Torah, and then with the Torah, he created the world. The Torah, therefore, also is infused in every aspect of this world, or better put, every aspect of this world. Even this water bottle right here is rooted in the Torah, in some verse in the Torah, in some word, in some letter, or even in some crown of a letter in the Torah. We mentioned also that, some of the great rabbis of Vilna Gaon, for example, learned mathematics just from the first letter of the Torah, almost as if to point out that the entire world of mathematics can be found in that first letter. Again, everything is rooted back to the Torah. And in a way, he was starting to say that's really the goal of every human being, is to try and connect this world to its source, not to the Torah that's a strange or something that's different from this world, but rather to recreate this harmony between the world and the Torah. And when we say a blessing, to go back to this water bottle, when we say a blessing over this water bottle, that we're actually connecting it to its holy source, reconnecting it, and that's what it might be waiting for since it was created, since the water came from some spring it's not a spring, it's not spring water. So from wherever, from the Coca-Cola company. Since then, it's been waiting to reconnect to its source. It's almost like bringing a child back home. This is bringing a child back home each time you say a blessing. Because again, everything is rooted in the Torah. So that's really the big idea. We also spoke about not just the blessings that are recited, but even like the names of certain things, the Hebrew names of all things in this world really relate to the energy source of everything. So if the name for a stone, I think that's the example we used, is Evan in Hebrew, right? Evan is the name for stones in Hebrew. Evan, those three letters, Aleph, Bet, Nun, which spell out the word Evan in Hebrew, that's the gas station, the energy source, so to speak, of the stone itself. All stones in the world derive their energy from those three Hebrew letters. By the way, Evan also comes from Bniyah, which means to build. Stones come to build the world. So in any case, so that's one of the ways we also see this intrinsic connection between the Torah and the world. Let's continue on page 67. Does anyone want to read? Right. I think it relates well to a passage in the Talmud that speaks about a big argument that went on for 3 years between the rabbis, the Talmudic rabbis, some 2,000 years ago. What is considered greater? Talmud Gadol or Maaseh Gadol? That was the big question. Is the study of the Torah greater than the action, than the doing the mitzvot? Or is the action greater than the learning? And there was a big argument, and the rabbis split into two groups. Some said, no, Talmud Gadol, study is greater. Some say Maaseh Gadol, action is greater. And then after 3 years, they came to a conclusion. What conclusion? A conclusion that will confuse all of us here. And that is, Gadol Talmud shemevi lidei maaseh. What is greater? Study is greater because it brings to action. But if you say that study is greater just because it brings to action, so action is greater. Right? Mm-hmm. But no, study is greater because without study, you can't have action. But without action, you can't have study. Without any study, zero study, probably not. But with a little bit of study, yes. But it's a big question, just to put it Kabbalistically, and it's a subject in Hasidic discourses in many, many places. What brings more pleasure to God? And the analogy that's used in Hasidic courses is really a parental analogy. Imagine with your own children, right? What would bring you more pleasure? To study with them, or your children fulfilling your desires? If you tell your child, bring me a cup of water, and he brings you a cup of water, does that bring you more pleasure than sitting and doing your homework with him? I'll tell you what Kabbalah has to say. Hasidic teachings speak about this, and I think it's connected very much, that there are 4 types of pleasure in the world. There's the physical pleasures of this world, from eating an ice cream, physical pleasure, to some cookies, physical pleasure, or whatever it may be. Other physical pleasures may be more coarse or vulgar, by the way, every level of pleasure has 2 sides. There's the holy way of using the pleasure and the bad way of using pleasure. So the physical pleasure. The second is music. Music is considered as pleasure number 2. One may think that that's the highest, but it's not. The third type of pleasure is the pleasure of what they would call in Yiddish of chap. You ever heard of that word? Chap. Chapt. That means to grasp an idea. There's a light bulb that went on. That's the third. And that, by the way, is connected to Torah study. That's that pleasure. And the highest level of pleasure is the pleasure of doing a good deed. That's the highest pleasure. More than listening to Bach or Beethoven, or more than even studying Torah.
So it's action.
So, based on Kabbalah, the highest is really action. Nothing brings greater pleasure than action. Now, if you think about it more philosophically, you'll see that these 4 pleasures really carry 2 main themes. And one is going from selfish to selfless. The power of a deed is the power of selflessness. Really, if I'm studying, I might be studying for my light bulbs to go on. So you're really studying for yourself. When I'm doing a good deed, whether I'm doing it selfishly or not, it's still affecting someone else. I'm coming out of the bubble of the self. That's one. And the second ladder, I would say, of these pleasures is that these pleasures really are based on the divine ladder. That where can you experience God most? In action. That's where you experience God most. I don't know if we mentioned this verse, and if we did, you can stop me, but there's a verse in the book of Psalms, I think Psalm 33, Jeanette, tell me if I'm wrong, 33 or 34, that says, Lechu banim shimuli yirat Hashem al hamitchen, which means, go my children and listen to me, I will teach you the fear of God. Why does it say, go my children? It should say, come my children. When you tell your children to listen to you, say, come and listen to me. Go out to the world. When you go out to the world and do good deeds, that's where you'll learn the fear of God. That's when you'll connect to God. The mitzvah is still there. If I gave $5 to a homeless man for everyone to come and take pictures and I can post it on Facebook, like some people do, unfortunately, then you're right. It's very selfish and self-centered, but the homeless still got those $5. So you still did a mitzvah, but in a very, very coarse way. That's why I said each of these 4 levels really have 2 sides to them. They have their darker side and their lighter side, or the physical side and the spiritual side, or maybe the animalistic side, in the words of the Tanya, and the godly side. So with physical pleasures, you can, this is the example the world will bring. Sex could be a very physical and unholy and vulgar and lowly pleasure, but it could be the holiest act a person does. It's in the context of marriage. There's nothing greater than that. And it's really seen, by the way, it's seen as, I was just sitting with the groom this morning, it's seen as the holiest act a person can do. Why? Because in order to create children, you need God in the picture. Talmud says there are 3 partners to man: his father, his mother, and God. Without God, man can't be created. So, really, that moment is a moment which you are the closest to God. So it can be seen as the holiest act. Same with music. You can have music that contaminates your mind and your soul, and I'm not going to mention any singers, but you find them everywhere today. And you have music that elevates the soul, and same with study. You have study that corrupts the mind, and you have study that elevates the mind, like the study of Torah. And same with good deeds, right? You have good deeds, are very self-centered and very self-promotional oriented, and that you have deeds that are altruistic, that you come out of the bubble of the self and you reach out to someone else. And I think that's where God is found. God is found most. It's interesting because it's connected to our portion, this week's parsha. But this week's parsha speaks of the construction of the tabernacle and all of its utensils. And it's interesting to note that God makes a point to tell Moses that after you build this tabernacle, I will communicate to you from in between, mi bein shenei keruvim. That's what it says, from in between the two cherubims, who were those baby angelic faces that served as the cover of the ark, where the Torah or the tablets were kept. Right, the ark had a cover, and on it there were two of these cherubim. And God spoke to Moses from in between those two faces. Why from in between those two faces? That's because God was almost saying to Moses, according to Arachaim HaKadosh of Chaim Ben Attar of Morocco 400 years ago, he says, because God is found in the in-between space that we create. Not found on me. If I think that God is only here, I'm completely wrong. Say in between space. We find the same idea in the Talmud. The Talmud says that Ish v'isha zachu, if a man and a woman, if a husband and a wife merited, Shechina shruya beinehem. The Shechina, or God's presence, dwells in between them. The husband says, no, I'm right. Or the wife says, I'm right. I have the truth. I have God. You don't. God isn't there. But it's in the in-between space that we create that God is found. And it's that fourth level of pleasure again, where I'm creating an in-between space with someone else. And that's where God is found the most. I don't know if I mentioned this, but the chief rabbi of Tekoa in Israel, which is a village just outside of Jerusalem, Alav Shalom, Rabbi Menachem Fruman, who passed away some 2 years ago, he was a very interesting character in Israel. Very well known. People would come to him from all over Israel, first because he was pious, but also because he was very controversial in many ways. For example, he was very vocal about the peace process in a way that he said that he thinks that it's a religious conflict and therefore it can only be solved by religious leaders. And he would invite imams to his house and try and start a dialogue, because that's how he thought of the peace process. But in any case, when journalists would come to his house and try and interview him and learn about him, he would say to them, look, don't take pictures of me. I'm not an interesting guy. But if you want, right here in Tekoa, I can show you God himself. You can take a picture of God himself. They would say, what do you mean? And then he would go to his wife, put his arms around her, and say, here, God is in between us. Take a picture of the in between. That's where God is. But in a way, that's that fourth level. It's the in between space that we create. And I think that's also, if you think about this, it's also the most lasting pleasure. Because when you do something good for someone else, that creates a ripple effect that really lives on to eternity. And that goodness is translated to more good deeds. You've impacted a heart, so that heart that also starts to pump with good deeds. And while if you just have a physical pleasure, level one, it comes and goes, doesn't stay. So it's also the most lasting. Now again, I have to point out that pleasure is not bad. I know pleasure is a negative connotation these days. Depends how you use it. Everything though comes from God, and therefore there's goodness in everything. The Talmud, not to digress too much, just as class more on Kabbalistic books on Kabbalah, but there's a beautiful Kabbalistic twist to this story. I don't know if you remember the story of Rabbi Akiva, who was a very optimistic leader, and he was walking in Jerusalem by Mount Scopus. I'm sure many of you have been there. If you go to Mount Scopus, you can see Temple Mount from Mount Scopus, and he was walking on Mount Scopus with some of his friends, and he saw the second temple burning in flames. So his friends, this was during the times of the destruction of the Second Temple, his friends began to cry. And Rabbi Akiva began to laugh. So they said to him, why are you laughing? He said to them, why are you crying? They said to him, well, we're crying, it's obvious. The temple that was such holiness has now foxes coming out of it and it's burning in flames. But why are you laughing? And he said, I'm laughing because now that God destroyed the second temple, then I know that the third temple will be built and the holiness then will be much greater, to paraphrase him. But the Kabbalistic commentaries explain something very deep and very, very beautiful. Speaking of pleasures, the Kabbalistic commentaries say that what Rabbi Akiva was really saying, he was saying to his friends, look, if pleasure that is created for the nations that hate us, pleasure that is created, when God has, through God's inadvertent actions or actions where his willingness is really not there, through God's malintention, then imagine the pleasure that there will be when that third temple will be built through God's willing action. Imagine the level of pleasure there will be then. But there's pleasure in the world. They connect to the lowliest level of pleasure from destroying the temple or from destroying a nation. But imagine the amount of pleasure that will come out when God is in it completely. And in a way, that's really what we have to think of when we delve into all sorts of pleasures. What type of pleasure are we deriving, or are we indulging ourselves in? And the idea that also light always follows darkness. The Leonard Cohen line is beautiful. It goes like this: forget the perfect offering, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light comes in. It's very true. It's connected to the root of creation. Think about this, and again, many Kabbalistic sources speak about this, but the Jewish day begins when? At night, right? That's why Shabbat begins at night. Why? Why don't we wait till midnight? Really, so you should be like celebrating New Year at 5 p.m., 6 p.m., because it becomes dark. Why do you have to wait till midnight? If you follow the Jewish time, you can go to sleep by midnight. So why does it start? But why is that the way? I mean, our birthdays begin in the evening. Anything, the holidays begin in the evening. We start counting the day from the evening. Why is that the way? Because it's rooted in creation. How did God count the days? First the evening, and then the morning. Now, there's a passage in the Talmud that speaks of two great rabbis that were related. One was son-in-law, the other was his father-in-law. And the son-in-law, I forget the name, I think it was Rabbi Huna, maybe I'm wrong. But one of the son-in-law once came to visit his father-in-law. And it's an interesting exchange. And it says that right even before entering the home of his father-in-law, he was very happy because he had noticed through the window that his father-in-law was in a good mood. Now, I don't know if I go to my father-in-law, I don't know what my mood is at the entrance of his home. But he was very happy. Anyway, he sees his father-in-law in a good mood. He says, I'm going to ask him a question. He's a great rabbi. I'm going to ask him a question that I've had trouble with. This is the time to ask him any question I'm sure that I have. So he says to his father-in-law, can I ask you a question? Why is it that when we herd goats and sheep together, usually the sheep are in front and then the goats follow? Why is that the order? And the father-in-law says, oh, that's simple. It's because it says first there was evening and then there was morning. So that's why the order of the sheep and the goats. The sheep that are white represent the morning, the goats that are dark represent the evening, and therefore that's the order. It's rooted in creation. Now, what are they speaking about? And is that the question to ask? If you had one question to ask someone who was in a good mood, is that the question you would ask? And the answer, I think, is roots back to what we're saying. That yes, in life there are evenings. There are dark moments. There are challenges. There are cracks. But the Rabbi Akivas of life know that morning follows. And that's why we count the way we count as Jews. We know that there are evenings. Well, we can't despair. We count it as non-Jews. The non-Jewish calendar ends with darkness. The day ends with darkness. Our day ends with light. We have that staunch belief that after every darkness there's light. After every evening there's morning. I think if you think about this, that's the way life is. We start life where? In darkness. In the womb of our mothers. And then we come out to light. And then we die and we go to the grave, to darkness. But then we also believe in the resurrection of the dead, where light will come again. Morning always follows evening. So that's the Rabbi Akiva, that's the optimistic. So sheep represent more purity. Whiteness is the color of purity. Also the nation of Israel is compared to sheep. It's compared to sheep in the Tanakh, but in the Bible and in the Talmud it's compared to Kivsa Achat ben Shivim Ze'evim. That we're compared to like one sheep among 70 wolves. And then the Talmud says, Ma yechola la'asot, what can it do? And it answers that, yeah, but the sheep is with God. And when the sheep is with God, it protects it from all of the 70 wolves. You're right, it has this, and Jews are not like that. Jews are also very stiff-necked people, right? Am Kshei Oref. So, on the other hand, you have sheep that are rebellious. That's the famous story about Moses, where how he was chosen to become a leader. He had a rebellious sheep. He was a shepherd, and he nonetheless went after that sheep and brought it back to the herd and hugged it and so on. And God said, if you can have a compassion towards a sheep like that, then he should be the leader of the Jewish people. But so you have sheep that are also rebellious. So, not to get too into zoology or spiritual zoology, but I'll tell you this, it's connected very much to Rosh Hashanah because there are different types of cries. And in fact, the three cries that we have through the shofar, the one that's long, Tekiah, Shevarim, and Teruah, are three cries that really stem from three animals. So there's an animal that has a long, like a Tekiah, like what type? It's not a bark, it's howl. I think that's a good one. And then you have animals that have broken, and then you have the sheep's cry, which is like teruah, and it's specifically the sheep's cry that really is the most precious of the three. It's what breaks the gates of heaven open, so to speak. So you have that element in sheep too. Right. All right. Fine. Okay. So going back to this idea that really action is also an aspect of the Torah. That's why Torah is called Hora'ah. And we don't just learn to learn, but we learn to translate the learning into action, and that, in a way, the fourth level of pleasure. But let's continue on here at the bottom of page 67, theoretically. Right. So there's a lot being said here in this paragraph, of course, but the idea is that the more a person breaks that selfishness or that ego, and the more he devotes himself to God and to what God wants from him, not only what he wants from God, but what God wants from him, then the more a person can become that vehicle to holiness, that vehicle to godliness, and become Torah himself, become a walking Torah. Now, to reach that level, which only a few reach, like he said, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it takes a lot. But everyone can try and do so in certain areas of his life. That when I eat dinner, I'll be a walking Torah. When I'm interacting with one person, I'll be a walking Torah. We might not be able to achieve it all the time, like Abraham and so on, but we can achieve it in parts of our day-to-day schedule. And the more in tune we are with what God wants from us, the more we can become that walking Torah. I think it's very much connected. Going back to Rabbi Menachem Fruman, I just remembered also another thing that he would do, which is very much connected. But when he would do counseling for couples, so if you walk into any therapist or even a rabbi's office or something like that, people that do counseling for couples, you have a husband sitting on one chair and the wife sitting on the other chair. What Rabbi Menachem Fruman would do, he would add a third chair. And they would ask him why, who's coming? He said, no, that's the chair for God. He's also a partner. And then from time to time during the counseling, he would say, oh, good idea. I don't know if I agree. Let's ask God. That's great. And it would change the whole chemistry, of course, in the room. Now, you can do that with marriage counseling, but you can do that with yourself. So you have yourself, you have your own opinions, you have your perspectives on life. Why don't you ask God? There's a God living here also. And I think the more we ask God, the more we allow that empty chair to make those decisions, and the more in tune we are with it, of course, or with God, then the more we can become those walking Torahs. And I think really that's the great difference between men and women that are considered holy, or saints, or righteous, or tzaddikim, however you want to call them, and those who are not. The more righteous you are, the less sense of self you have. And Winston Churchill said that humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. Then they don't think of themselves at all. They're not humble. You can't even say that they're humble because they don't think of themselves, period. I know Rabbi Steinsaltz himself, the author of this book, I don't think, he's never taken a day of vacation. He's always devoted to the other, 24/7. When does he think of himself? Never. I think Lubavitcher Rebbe was that way. Not because they don't have a sense of self. They have the greatest self-esteem. They know exactly who they are. They have this inner confidence that is unshakable. But because they know that their purpose in life is not to ask questions about me, it's to ask questions about you. To be other-oriented, not me-oriented. And I think the more you are like that, the more righteous you are. And that's exactly what he's saying here. The more of a walking Torah you are, because that's what the goal of the Torah is, to transform man. In that sense, if a person learns Torah and it doesn't make any impact on him, then, the Talmud says something very harsh, the Tractate of Kiddushin, that the Torah can be a drug of life or it can be a drug of death. Some chaim or some mavet. That's what it says. How do we know this? Because it says in the Shema, in the second paragraph of the Shema, it says, "V'samtem et devarai ele." Samtem can be read samtam, a complete drug. Samtam. It can be a complete drug of life, a complete drug of death. If you use it for you, it's death. If you use it for others, then it's life. I think the key, and maybe I'm wrong, but just observing Rabbi Steinsaltz himself, I think the way I see Rabbi Steinsaltz is that is not just come out of his bubble of self emotionally and psychologically or intellectually, but I think he's very action-oriented. He's very much driven towards doing, and I think that's something we can all emulate. We might feel all sorts of feelings inside here, but at the end of the day, it's what you do that really counts. Yeah, but even if you don't know how to do it, you should still do it. Like we said about the homeless man, because it might be a selfish deed, but and the more you do it, the more you become it. And if you do evil, then you become evil. I think the pop culture's example for it's not just pop culture; it's real. Oskar Schindler. Oskar Schindler wasn't a good man at all. He was a terrible human being. He employed all these Jews also for very selfish purposes. They were cheap labor. Actually, they weren't cheap. They were zero labor. And he was a womanizer, a member of the Nazi Party. He was a profiteer, the highest class. But he did good and did good and did good and did good. And today you tell someone, hey, Oskar Schindler, such a kind and good man. Which is threw it away because he became his deed. You become your deed. And I think that's to answer your question. That's very much what Rabbi Steinsaltz says now. And I think that's why Rabbi Steinsaltz says, I know we mentioned this many times, but I once asked him if he could condense the idea of Judaism to one word. What word would it be? He didn't say love. He didn't say Torah. He said consistency. Because to do good, at the spur of the moment, that's easy. But to do good continuously, consistently, that's much harder. And that's it. So it's not just doing good, but doing good consistently. That's what transformed you. And I think that's how you become a walking Torah. At least in some areas of our lives, if not all the time. Like, patriarchs, like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. I will say this, that, a great story, I don't know if I ever mentioned it to you, but maybe we'll conclude with this one, but you can find it on YouTube. If you want, I can email it to you and email it to the rest. It's a beautiful story about the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Schneerson, who was just recently recounted by the person who experienced it. His name was Meshulam Weiss. Meshulam Weiss is a man today, must be in his 60s or 70s, but he tells a story of how just before he got married, he went with his bride to receive a blessing from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. I think it was a Thursday night. And in the middle of the private audience with the Rebbe, his wife-to-be tells him, "Do you mind leaving? I need to speak to the Rebbe privately." So he left. He left after 20 minutes. She called him back, and the Rebbe gave them a blessing for their wedding coming up on Sunday. They didn't see each other until Sunday. Sunday they get married. The second after the chuppah, they go into the yichud room, into the room where they're secluded by themselves. And then he says to her, "Why did you kick me out of the room?" And she says to him, "Tell you the truth, I wanted to cancel our marriage." "Why?" And she said, "I told the Rebbe that I'm a very angry person. I get angry frequently. Any stupid things makes me angry. And I knew this would affect our marriage, so I wanted to cancel our marriage. So I told the Rebbe, I want to cancel the marriage. Should I, shouldn't I?" The Rebbe smiled. And he said, "Oh, don't worry about it. Children will teach you patience, and please God, you'll have many children." And then the Rebbe said to her, "And until you have children, then you should engage yourself in deeds of kindness. Go visit the sick, go. And that too will make sure that your anger goes away." Again, focus on that action. Now, many, many, many years later, Meshulam Weiss tells the story. It's on YouTube. His wife, after menopause, went to a doctor, and this doctor checked in and said to her, "Wow, you're a religious woman. You must be a very sad woman too." She says to the doctor, "Why?" The doctor says, "Because I see you have what's it called, an infertile womb. It's impossible for you to have children." Now this woman had 17 children.
Oh my God.
So she told the doctor, she didn't say anything to the doctor, she just smiled. She went home and told her husband the story, and they had a good laugh about it. And then they realized, you see, the Lubavitcher Rebbe not only gave them a great advice, but through that advice, he gave her a blessing that she'll have many children, and those children will teach her patience. But I'm telling you the story because we often say, "Oh, I'm angry. What am I going to do about it?" And I'm emotional, and it's always me, 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 me. All these emotions are me, me. So then go do something good. Go visit the sick and make it consistent, and you'll see that those feelings will sooner or later dissipate. And in a way, that's why action is the highest level of pleasure. It transforms you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Happy birthday.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you.